If You Traveled West in a Covered Wagon by Ellen Levine. Page 28. How far would you travel in a day? On many days, you would travel 10 to 15 miles. If it was muddy and raining hard, you might make 1 mile in a whole day. Today, if you are driving in a car on the highway, you usually travel 65 miles in 1 hour. In a covered wagon, it might take you 6 or even 7 days to go as far as you can go today in 1 hour. You would usually have to get up very early to start traveling in the wagons. Most people got up around 4 o'clock in the morning when it was still dark. First, they would start the fire so they could cool breakfast. Then they would round up the cattle and start to load up the wagons with the tents, blankets, pots, and pans. The wagons would start moving by 7 o'clock in the morning and travel until lunchtime. Then you would rest for an hour or two. After lunch, you would travel again until about 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 o'clock at night. Finally, you would stop until the next day. After 5 or 6 months, you would have traveled more than 2,000 miles. Today, that would take about 3 or 4 days in a car and 3 to 4 hours in an airplane. Would you ride in the wagon for the whole trip? No. In fact, you probably wouldn't ride for even most of the way. If you ever had a chance to ride in a covered wagon for more than an hour, you would know why. Too bumpy. There were no smooth highways or roads back in the 1840s. Sometimes you made your own trail by being the first wagon to go over a piece of ground. Other times you rode in the ruts made by other wagon wheels. You could feel every bump when you sat in the wagon. There were no cushioned seats, just wooden boards covered with a few blankets. Much of the time you would walk next to the wagon. The wagons traveled very slowly, so you could easily keep up with them. When your feet got very tired, then you might climb up and ride for a while, and sometimes you might want to ride in the wagon just to get the view from up high. The drivers would often walk alongside the oxen. They didn't use reins. They would shout and sometimes use a whip, but you wouldn't hit the animals. You would just crack the whip over their heads to make them go the way you wanted. What were the dangers and difficulties of the trip? One of the biggest problems was mud. Sometimes it would rain for days on the prairies, and then there would be mud, and more mud. You could sink right up to your knees in mud, and if you could sink, so could the oxen, cows, and horses. When the sun came out, most of the mud would dry up in a few hours. Sometimes, though, the wagon wheels would still be stuck. Then the children would help gather long grasses. You would lay them across the ground in front of the wagon wheels. Then the oxen would pull from the front and people would push from behind. The wheels would turn onto the grass and slowly come up out of the mud. The opposite problem is when the ground is too dry. Then there would be dust, so much dust that it would get in your eyes, your mother's eyes, your father's eyes, and the cattle's eyes. The dust would be so thick that you could hardly see your hand in front of your face. When that happened, sometimes you had to stop traveling because you couldn't see the trail at all. Most of the time, though, you just kept going anyway and hoped you were going the right way. Where would you sleep? Sometimes you would sleep in the wagon, sometimes under it, sometimes in a tent, and sometimes out in the open under the stars. There wasn't enough room in the wagon to bring a mattress for everyone in the family. So if there was one mattress, usually your mother and father would sleep on it. They might leave the mattress in the wagon if there was enough room, or they might put it in a tent and sleep there. Babies and little children usually slept in the wagon. If it was raining, it wasn't easy to keep completely dry. The best place was inside the wagon. The next best place was in the tent. You would probably get a little wet if you put your blankets under the wagon and it went to sleep there. If it looked like it might rain when your parents set up the tent, they would dig a ditch around the tent so that water would run off into the ditch and not under the tent. If you were going to sleep under the wagon when it was raining, your mother and father would wrap your blankets in an oilskin, which is a piece of cloth that has been rubbed with oil and is waterproof. In good weather, the nicest place to sleep was out in the open under the starry skies. If you lay on your back and looked up at the faraway stars, you could pick one, call it Oregon, and try and think about how long it would take you to get there. Oregon would seem almost as far as that star.